Now, the blonde hair, the white apron, the sense of adventure, and, of course, the blue dress. I am talking about Alice's adventures in Wonderland, and it stayed in our imaginations, be it through stage, screen, pop culture, and it's been around for 150 years. Now, I'm joined now by Reverend Dr. Ian Ellis-Jones. He's a lecturer on psychiatry at the New South Wales Institute of Psychiatry. He was previously a senior lecturer of law at UTS, and he is a Sydney minister and convener. So he discussed the myths, ancient, esoteric and literary symbology in a recent address and dissertation at the Spirit of Life Unitarian Fellowship and recently at the Theosophical Society in Sydney. I'm very pleased to say I'm joined by Reverend Dr. Ian Ellis-Jones. Good morning.
Good morning, Jamie.
Thank you so much for your time this morning.
My pleasure.
How did Alice's adventures in Wonderland draw you in? I mean, you presumably weren't around 150 years ago, but I mean, has the novel...
Not quite that old.
Not quite that old. Okay, well, you're forgiven. Has the novel provided you with any insights or lessons that we can take away from it today?
Look, first of all, I mean, I've always loved children's stories. It sounds a strange thing. That even to this day, I probably spend more time reading children's stories and speaking about them to various church groups, literary groups, than I do reading adult books, although I love crime fiction, and there's quite a difference there. Look, I mean, my parents must have grown up with the same books, probably more so than they gave me, but around me as a kid, I always had Grimm's fairy tales and the tales of Hans Christian Andersen and books on Greek mythology. And then there was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And then there was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. And I might make passing reference to that, only passing reference, because there are similarities there. So I grew up with fairy tales, and I came to see that there was a certain similarity to most of these tales, that there was some kind of hero or heroine, there was a journey, there was a quest of some sort, a lot of problems, a lot of trials, a lot of enemies, and eventually there was some sort of overcoming and return to the so-called ordinary world. And when I was studying arts and law at Sydney Uni in the 1970s, I used to probably spend more time in the Adyar bookshop, which sadly is gone now, by the Theosophical Society. But they had a wonderful collection of books on comparative religion and philosophy. And I started reading Joseph Campbell, the hero of 1,000 faces.
I was going to say, this is all sounding very Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, it is.
Is that that's the idea that you have
criticism of Joseph Campbell?
Well, it's the idea that you have the monomyth. You know, that all these stories do follow the similar pattern. You know, meeting the older mentor, being gifted with the sword, the magic sword, or whatever it may be.
It is, and you know, I've seen stuff on Disney's website that they try to encapsulate in almost all of their films. We'll probably talk about a couple later, this monomyth. Mind you, a lot of academics have criticized it and said, look, it's too simplistic. Not all stories neatly fit into that sort of imposition of a superstructure, if that's what it is. But I think that many of them do, and even stories in religion, the stories of Jesus and so forth, are amenable to that sort of interpretation too. So far as the insights, lessons we can learn from Alice, look, two things seem to come out of Alice in Wonderland, apart from the fact that it's a very entertaining tale. Firstly, there is this constant confusion about words and language and identity. Alice doesn't know who she is half the time. She shrinks in size, and she gets bigger, and she's changed many times. And she comes to realize that which we call the self, that which we think we are, is not us at all. And she finally learns that she is the person Alice. We're not given her last name. And I think in this postmodern world where there's a lot of epistemological anarchy, where every person has their opinion, every person has their narrative, their worldview, that we suddenly realize that there's no real path at all. We have to create our own path through life. And I think the other thing that comes out of Alice and many similar books like The Wizard of Oz is that most of the characters in the book are so damn self-obsessed. And we see that these days, don't we, and with some of our polys, how narcissistic we have become, how self-obsessed and self-absorbed, and that we have to overcome this sense of self, which brings so much isolation and loss of identity. We have to overcome our self-obsession if we're ever going to find ultimate meaning in life, which we have to find. There's no ultimate meaning that's innately in us, I don't think.
Well, I feel, Ian, that if you want to become an MP, then narcissism is actually quite a good trait. I think you need a narcissist card to get into the House of Reps, I think. Now, you were talking before about growing up with Grimm's fairy tales and other stories like that. When you look at those, there's some really deep, the original Grimm's fairy tales, really deep, dark adult themes. And that's quite similar to Alice. Do you not think that there are these deep, dark adult themes which have over time, been adapted for children, but there is a real dark element to a lot of these. Would you agree?
That's true. I mean, some of them are really quite frightening for kids. There's normally a lot of death and killing and eating people up. And clearly, this is written in what's sometimes referred to as the occult or secret language. And this is nothing voodoo or nothing supernatural. It's just that we find the same thing in sacred scripture. And it's such a shame that so many people take these things literally, that the words and phrases and images have certain meanings. For example, how often there is climbing a ladder or a staircase, which is symbolic of ascending in knowledge. And then you have, generally in these things you have, in these fairy tales, which are quite mythological too, with very ancient roots, you'll find that there is a pure, innocent child or young woman who kind of represents the human soul. And then you'll have normally a wicked stepmother who represents and encapsulates evil forces that threaten the innocence of the soul. And then there is this quest or journey, this search for a Prince Charming, and then they live happily ever after. And what that really is kind of like we come to our true self. We find ourselves complete. It's not really so much as marrying someone or finding a partner, but finding a completeness in yourself between your own soul and spirit, however you interpret those terms.
Ian, you're talking here about Alice in Wonderland. If you've just joined me, I am on the line with Reverend Dr. Ian Ellis-Jones, which, just briefly, is a great title. I mean, you must have the world's largest business card.
Oh, gosh. just call me Ian.
Ian, but we're talking here about Alice in Wonderland. And as I alluded to before, there have been some recent adaptations, appropriations of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. I mean, if you look at Tim Burton and Disney, do you think what they have portrayed in their films really go to the heart of what Carroll was meaning and what he was writing 150 years ago?
Look, I think most of the recent, and I'm going back to about 1951, that's recent for me, maybe not for you, Jamie. There's been about 17 adaptations of Alice in Wonderland, and some of them have been quite bizarre. I remember about 1966, there was one by the BBC, and it was quite a send-up of the thing, a parody. I think the two best versions have been Disney's 1951 animated adaptation, which from
It's
memory
probably
was
the most
about
iconic, I'd say.
That was extremely good and very faithful to the original, and I guess it set in concrete many of the elements of the story that we've come to understand as commonplace. The Cheshire Cat that disappears and leaves only its grin and so forth. Tim Burton's 2010 Alice in Wonderland, which was released by Disney, you mentioned, Johnny Depp, Anne Hathaway, was a tremendous work as well. It really borrowed from previous adaptations, but it made quite a considerable change. I mean, Tim Burton, before he made the film and during it and after it, has said many times that his goal was to flesh out the character of Alice. I remember he said in previous versions, he said, it was always a girl wandering around from one crazy character to another, and I never really felt any real emotional connection. So he wanted to give Alice a real psychological and emotional grounding so that it was a real story to it, and rather than just a series of crazy episodes. And you might, if you've seen that film, it begins, of course, with Alice as an adult returning to Wonderland, which wasn't in the original book. I mean, the original book was Alice having a dream by a river and eventually woken up by her sister.
Sorry, go on, Ian.
Yeah, so that's basically it. So, I think both of those versions that I mentioned have been faithful to the original. Possibly Tim Burton's has gone further than what Carroll might have liked in terms of the psychology. That's a hard word to say, psychologizing of the character, the protagonist, the heroine. But look, both of them have been very faithful, and I think they have done great justice to the original work.
Well, I suppose with Tim Burton, he's an absolute master, particularly when he's paired up with Johnny Depp, of really getting into those dark, almost creepy elements. I mean, you look at his work with, say, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It was a very, very different version, I feel, from, the original, the Gene Wilder.
The Gene Wilder one, which I remember seeing when I was at university, yes.
Yeah, and he really gets into that deep, kind of dark, psychological, as I said, almost creepy elements of it. But look, it's fascinating having talked to you. Thank you so much, Reverend. I mentioned before, my grandmother happens to have a first edition copy of Alice in Wonderland.
Don't you ever lose that.
Well, I'm not even allowed to touch it. It sits in a box and gathers dust. But Ian, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Anytime. Thank you, Jamie. It's been a pleasure talking to you too.
That's Reverend Dr. Ian Ellis-Jones there on Alice in Wonderland and what it means today, 150 years on. It still is. It still is. I mean, it is obviously a literary gem. However, it still relates to so much we do today. He was talking there about narcissism and self-involvement. And, you can just look around here in Sydney, around the world, and that's definitely still prevalent. Well, that's great. Thank you so much for your company here this morning on Saturday Breakfast.